I'm desperate for a man's warmth. Giant Apache girl, said widowed rancher. Samuel leaned on the wooden fence, staring out across the wide stretches of his ranch.
The sun was low in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. The wind blew softly, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and dry grass. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made him feel both peace and loneliness at the same time. Since his wife had passed, Samuel's days had been filled with work, tending the cattle, fixing fences, and walking the land she had loved so much. But in the evenings, the silence pressed in on him. He missed the sound of her voice, the warmth of her hand in his, the laughter that used to echo through the ranch house. Life had gone on, but a part of him had stopped the day she was gone. The ranch was large and isolated, set against a backdrop of mesas and rolling hills. Life there was hard but honest. Samuel had learned to rely on himself, to solve problems with his own hands, and to trust only the few people who lived in nearby towns. Visitors were rare and neighbors were sometimes hours away. Most days the only company he had were his cattle, the dogs that followed him around, and the occasional hawk circling high above the desert. He liked the solitude in some ways, but in other ways it reminded him of what he had lost. Sometimes he wondered if he had gotten too used to being alone, if his heart had begun to forget what it felt like to truly connect with someone. He had heard stories about the woman before he ever saw her. People called her the giant Apache girl because of her height and strength, and because she carried herself with a confidence that made people take notice. She was from a nearby Apache community, a young woman trying to find her place in a world that often seemed too small for her. Rumors said she was brave and independent, someone who had survived hardships most people could not imagine. Some said she was searching for companionship, that she longed for a life where she could be close to someone she trusted. Samuel was skeptical about all the stories. In his experience, rumors often twisted reality into something unrecognizable. But even so, he found himself thinking about her. Something about the thought of meeting someone so strong yet vulnerable stirred feelings he hadn't felt in years. The first time he saw her, she was walking along the edge of the ranch, her shadow stretching long across the dusty ground. She moved with purpose, yet there was a cautiousness in her steps, as if she were aware of how different she looked from everyone else. Her long hair shone in the late afternoon sun, and her eyes held a kind of quiet intensity that made Samuel pause. For a moment he simply watched her, leaning on the fence, feeling a mix of curiosity and something he could not quite name. He wondered who she really was, what brought her to this remote part of the desert, and why she seemed so determined to face the world on her own. When she finally spoke, it was in a voice that was both firm and open, a voice that did not shy away from the truth. "I'm looking for work," she said, approaching him with confidence. "I can help around the ranch." He was used to polite conversation, to people being careful with their words. But she seemed different. She didn't hide what she wanted, and she didn't seem afraid of him or his reaction. There was honesty in her eyes that Samuel hadn't seen in a long time, a rare kind of honesty that made him feel both cautious and intrigued. Over the next few days, she began to stay at the ranch, helping with chores and learning the routines. She could lift heavy sacks of feed without struggling, mend fences with skill, and handle the animals as if she had always known them. Samuel watched her work, impressed by her strength and independence, but also noticing the moments when her eyes seemed to carry a quiet sadness. It was in those moments that he realized she was more than just a strong, capable woman. She was someone who had known loneliness, who had felt the weight of life's hardships. He felt a subtle connection forming, a bond built not on words, but on the shared understanding of what it meant to face life alone. Evenings at the ranch took on a new rhythm. Samuel and the Apache girl would sit on the porch after a long day, drinking tea or simply watching the sunset. They didn't talk much at first, just sharing the silence, letting the world move around them without pressure. But gradually, she began to speak of her life, her dreams, and her fears. She told him stories of growing up in her community, of the expectations placed on her, and of the struggles to find her own path. Samuel listened, feeling a sense of awe at her resilience and courage. He saw in her a reflection of his own life in some ways, the loneliness, the longing, and the quiet strength that kept them both moving forward. At night, when the desert grew cold and the stars filled the sky, Samuel found himself thinking about her more than he expected. He realized he had been avoiding the idea of companionship, afraid that opening his heart again might bring pain. But seeing her, talking to her, and simply being in her presence began to soften that fear. He began to understand that maybe it was not weakness to feel again, to care again, but a kind of strength, a willingness to let life in, even after it had hurt him. The Apache girl, in turn, seemed to notice the small changes in him. She saw the way his shoulders relaxed when she was around, the way his eyes held a spark of curiosity and warmth that had been missing. She felt a quiet hope growing inside her, a hope that perhaps she could find a place where she belonged. She didn't speak of desperation, not yet, but the longing in her heart was clear. She wanted warmth, not just the physical kind, but the warmth of trust, companionship, and understanding. The desert itself seemed to reflect their journey. The land was harsh and demanding, but it also held beauty and quiet moments of wonder. Just as the ranch required patience, care, and attention, so too did the bond forming between Samuel and the Apache girl. Each day they learned more about each other, discovering the unspoken rules of connection, the ways in which trust is built, and the courage it takes to let someone into your life after years of solitude. By the end of the first month, the routine of the ranch had changed. Samuel no longer felt the weight of loneliness pressing on him as heavily. The Apache girl had become a presence he could rely on, someone who brought energy, laughter, and perspective into his quiet world. He knew there were challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but for the first time in a long while, he also felt a glimmer of hope. Life, he realized, could still hold surprises, and sometimes the most unexpected people could bring light into the darkest corners of the heart. The days that followed the Apache girl's arrival were not easy, though they were full of quiet discoveries. Samuel had lived a life of routine and solitude for so long that even small changes felt significant. Every morning he would rise before the sun, the chill of the desert air filling his lungs as he stepped outside. The Apache girl was often already awake, moving with calm efficiency. She tended the horses, fed the chickens, and prepared breakfast with a skill that suggested years of experience. Samuel watched her from a distance at first, cautious not to intrude, but also feeling a curiosity he had not experienced in years. There was something about her presence that made the ranch feel alive in a way it hadn't since his wife was alive. Despite her strength and independence, she seemed lonely too. She spoke little of her past, only revealing fragments of her life among the Apache community. She shared stories of the desert near her home, of streams and canyons, of winds that carried secrets through the valleys. Samuel listened, often surprised by her perspective. She saw beauty in the land where he had only seen work and responsibility. Her voice was calm, sometimes tinged with sadness, and sometimes carrying a spark of excitement when she described places she loved. Samuel began to sense that she, like him, had been carrying a quiet weight for a long time. One afternoon, as Samuel repaired a broken fence, the Apache girl approached him with a problem of her own. "I need a place to stay tonight," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "I don't want to be alone." Samuel paused. He had been careful with boundaries, unsure how much connection was wise, but her honesty and vulnerability made him hesitate in a different way. He nodded and gestured toward the small guest cabin near the barn. "You can stay there," he said softly. It was not just a practical solution, but an act of trust. She thanked him with a small smile, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them carried something unspoken, an understanding that both were searching for more than just shelter or work. Over the next few days, the Apache girl's presence became even more important to Samuel than he expected. He found himself noticing small details: the way she laughed when a calf slipped on the dirt, the way she tied knots with careful precision, the quiet patience she showed when teaching him a new trick for mending fences. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but slowly he began to rely on her not only for help around the ranch, but also for companionship. The walls he had built around his heart began to feel less rigid, and he started to realize that being around her brought a warmth he had not felt in years. Yet there were challenges. Samuel had never been good at expressing emotions, and he feared repeating the mistakes of the past. Sometimes he would catch himself thinking too deeply about her presence, questioning whether he was ready for the closeness she seemed to seek. At the same time, the Apache girl struggled with her own fears. She had learned to be self-reliant, to stand tall and face life alone. But now she felt the unfamiliar pull of wanting someone to lean on. Her pride and independence often conflicted with the tenderness growing inside her heart, and she found herself unsure how to reconcile the two. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Samuel and the Apache girl were sitting near the fire pit outside the cabin. The sky was a canvas of reds and purples, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. She turned to him suddenly and said, "I'm lonely, Samuel. I've been alone so long, and I don't know how to find someone who understands me. I'm not afraid of work or danger, but I am afraid of being alone forever." Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He had expected honesty, but the rawness of her words struck him more deeply than he anticipated. He looked at her, noticing the strength and vulnerability that existed side by side in her eyes. "I know what it feels like," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I've been alone for a long time, too. I don't know if I'm ready to let someone in again, but I understand what you're saying." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken emotions. The desert around them felt immense and silent, as if it were listening to their words. For the first time, both of them acknowledged the truth they had been feeling, but not yet saying aloud. They were lonely, they were searching, and they were beginning to consider the possibility of connection. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through shared moments of work and quiet conversation. She would help him move hay bales under the blazing sun, and he would offer advice when she repaired a gate or fed the animals. They laughed together when things went wrong, shared stories when they had the energy, and sometimes sat in silence, simply enjoying the presence of another person. Samuel realized that companionship was not about excitement or drama. It was about consistency, trust, and understanding. The Apache girl, in turn, found that sharing her life with someone who listened without judgment made her feel less isolated than she had in years. But life on the ranch was not without tension. Samuel faced challenges with neighboring ranchers who questioned his ownership of certain grazing lands. The Apache girl, despite her height and strength, could feel the pressure of prejudice from some townspeople who were wary of her background and her unusual presence in the area. Together, they navigated small confrontations and disagreements, learning to rely on one another in ways that tested their growing trust. Samuel began to see her not just as a helper or a companion, but as someone who could face the world alongside him, someone whose courage matched his own in unexpected ways. One morning, a sudden storm swept across the desert, turning dry dust into swirling clouds and sending heavy rain across the ranch. Samuel was caught outside with the cattle, and the Apache girl rushed to help him. They worked together through the mud and wind, guiding the frightened animals to safety. The intensity of the moment brought a new level of closeness between them. Their hands touched as they pushed a stubborn calf, their voices shouted over the roar of the storm, and when the rain finally eased, they looked at each other with relief and exhaustion. In that shared struggle, they realized how much they had come to rely on one another. After the storm, as they sat on the porch and dried off, the Apache girl spoke again. "I don't want to feel alone anymore," she said. "I want to find someone who understands me, someone I can trust, someone who can be there when life gets hard." Samuel looked at her and nodded slowly. "I think I've been feeling the same way," he admitted. "I don't know what will happen, but I do know I don't want to be alone anymore either."
There was a quiet honesty in his words, the kind that does not come easily to men who have carried loneliness for many years.
As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened in small but meaningful ways. The Apache girl began to feel more at home on the ranch, and Samuel started to imagine a life where he could share his days with someone again. They did not rush or force their connection, but the simple acts of caring, preparing meals, fixing fences, watching sunsets together, built a foundation of trust and understanding. Each day brought them closer, teaching them both that companionship is not about grand declarations, but about being present for one another through the ordinary and difficult moments of life. By the end of the second month, Samuel noticed that the ranch felt different. There was laughter in the barn when something went wrong, conversations over breakfast about plans for the day, and a shared sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The Apache girl had brought not only her strength and skill, but also a warmth and understanding that Samuel had longed for without realizing it. For her part, she found a sense of safety and acceptance she had rarely known. Together, they were slowly learning that life did not have to be faced alone, and that sometimes the people we least expect can bring the greatest comfort. Even as challenges continued, storms, disputes with neighbors, the harshness of the desert, the bond between Samuel and the Apache girl grew stronger. It was not a love story born of instant passion, but one built on trust, shared effort, and the simple recognition that two people could help each other carry the weight of life. Each day added another layer to their connection, and with each passing sunset they both began to believe that perhaps they had found what they had been looking for all along, someone to share the warmth, the hardships, and the quiet moments that make life meaningful. The desert morning was quiet, but a restless energy hung in the air. Samuel noticed it as he moved around the ranch, feeding the cattle and checking fences. The Apache girl was already outside, walking among the animals with careful attention. She seemed more confident than ever, yet there was a thoughtful look in her eyes, as if she were carrying something unsaid. Samuel had come to understand that her strength was only part of who she was. Beneath it lay a sensitive heart that longed for connection. He felt a growing curiosity about her inner world and a quiet hope that he might be able to offer some comfort. Life at the ranch had settled into a rhythm, but it was far from predictable. That week, Samuel faced unexpected challenges. A section of fence had collapsed during the night, and several calves had wandered into the rough brush beyond the pasture. He and the Apache girl set out to round them up. The sun was high and the desert heat pressed down on them, but they worked side by side without complaint. She moved with a mix of grace and power, handling the animals as if she had been born to do this work. Samuel admired her skill and dedication, but he also noticed moments when she paused, her gaze distant, as if thinking about something else. During a brief break, they sat under the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Samuel offered her water, and she accepted with a small smile. The wind rustled the leaves above them, carrying a soft, calming sound. "You're really strong," he said, trying to start a conversation. "And not just physically. I mean, the way you handle everything." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting surprise and something deeper. "Strength isn't just about muscles," she replied quietly. "It's about surviving, making it through the hard days, and still standing when others might fall. I've had to learn that young." Her words hung in the air, and Samuel felt a pang of understanding. He realized how much she had endured, and how much resilience it took to continue moving forward with courage. He thought about his own life, the loss of his wife, the isolation, the daily struggles of running a ranch alone. He understood that her strength was not just physical, but emotional, and that this was something rare and precious. It made him respect her even more, and it stirred feelings he had tried to keep buried for years. Over the next few days, Samuel noticed a shift in their relationship. Their conversations became deeper, more personal. She spoke of her childhood, the pride of her community, and the difficulties she faced as someone who was taller and stronger than most around her. Samuel shared memories of his wife, of the life they had built together, and of the emptiness he had felt since she passed. The exchange was not easy, but it was honest. For the first time in a long while, they were opening themselves to each other in ways that required courage and trust. One afternoon, a visitor arrived unexpectedly at the ranch. A neighboring rancher had come to discuss a dispute over grazing rights, and tensions rose quickly. Samuel felt the familiar anxiety of confrontation, but this time, he was not alone. The Apache girl stood beside him, calm and confident. She spoke with clarity and reason, helping to de-escalate the situation. Samuel was impressed not only by her intelligence, but also by her courage in facing someone older and more experienced in the harsh ways of the land. He realized that her presence gave him strength he had not known he could have, and that together they could handle challenges more effectively than either could alone. That evening, after the visitor had left, they sat quietly in the barn, exhausted from the day's events. The Apache girl leaned against the wooden wall, her eyes thoughtful. "You know," she said softly, "I've spent so long trying to be independent, trying to prove I can handle everything on my own. But maybe it's okay to have someone beside you, not someone to lean on completely, but someone who can share the weight." Samuel looked at her, understanding the truth in her words. He had felt the same, yet had been too cautious to admit it. "I think I'm learning that too," he said. "I didn't realize how much it matters to have someone who understands." As days turned into weeks, the bond between them deepened. They shared small routines, preparing meals together, checking the livestock, repairing fences, but each act carried significance. Samuel began to notice the subtleties of her character, the way she listened carefully, the way she offered help without expecting praise, the way she noticed the little things that made the ranch run smoothly. The Apache girl, in turn, saw his quiet wisdom, his patience, and his careful thoughtfulness. Each day she felt more at ease around him, more willing to share not just her work, but her feelings, hopes, and fears. One particularly hot afternoon, while repairing a broken water trough, Samuel cut his hand on a sharp piece of metal. The Apache girl quickly cleaned and bandaged the wound, her hands gentle yet precise. "You need to be more careful," she said, her voice firm but concerned. Samuel smiled faintly, grateful not only for her help, but also for her care. It was a small moment, but it carried weight, an acknowledgement that they were beginning to look out for each other in ways beyond work. Later that day, as they rested under the shade of the barn, the Apache girl spoke again. "I've never had someone notice the little things like you do," she said quietly. Samuel looked at her, unsure how to respond. Words were difficult, but he wanted her to know that her presence mattered deeply to him. "I notice because I care," he said simply. She nodded, a faint smile touching her lips, and for a moment, the silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than emptiness. Their closeness was tested one evening when a sudden storm rolled across the desert. The wind howled and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Samuel and the Apache girl rushed to secure the animals. Working together in the chaos, mud made footing difficult, and the thunder shook the barn doors. But they moved as a team, each anticipating the other's needs. At one point, they both reached for the same gate latch, their hands brushing. Neither pulled away immediately. For a brief moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, leaving only the shared recognition of trust and reliance. After the storm passed, they sat on the porch, wet and tired, watching the desert shimmer in the evening light. The Apache girl spoke softly. "I think I'm beginning to understand what it means to let someone in. Not just someone to work with, but someone to share life with." Samuel felt a warmth in his chest he had not felt in years. He realized he was no longer afraid of companionship. He was ready to allow connection, to open his heart carefully but sincerely. "I feel the same," he admitted. "I think we've both needed this, even if we didn't know it at first." The days that followed were full of small victories and tender moments. They continued to work together on the ranch, sharing responsibilities and learning from one another. Samuel began to notice changes in himself. He smiled more easily, felt lighter in spirit, and found joy in simple moments he had once overlooked. The Apache girl, too, felt a sense of belonging she had not known before. Together, they were discovering that life could be shared, that two people could face challenges with courage, and that trust and understanding could grow even in the most unexpected circumstances. By the end of Part 3, the turning point of their relationship was clear. Samuel and the Apache girl had faced difficulties together, shared honest conversations about loneliness and fear, and learned to rely on one another. The ranch, once a place of solitude and work, had become a space of connection, growth, and hope. Both knew the road ahead would have challenges, but for the first time in a long time, they were ready to face it together, with mutual respect, trust, and the quiet beginnings of a deeper bond. The desert morning was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that makes a person feel both calm and uneasy at the same time. Samuel had risen early, as always, checking the cattle and making sure the fences were secure. But there was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite explain. The Apache girl was already moving about the ranch, tending to the animals with her usual skill. Yet her eyes held a hint of worry. Samuel noticed it immediately. She was usually confident, even cheerful, and seeing her troubled stirred something protective in him. He had grown to care for her more deeply than he had expected, and the thought of anything happening to her made his chest tighten. That morning, news arrived that one of the neighboring ranchers was attempting to claim part of Samuel's grazing land. The dispute had been simmering for weeks, but now it was escalating. Samuel had faced difficult neighbors before, but this situation felt different. The man was stubborn and aggressive, refusing to negotiate and threatening legal action. Samuel felt a surge of anxiety. He had always tried to handle things calmly, but the possibility of losing part of his ranch, the land he had devoted his life to, filled him with unease. Apache girl noticed his tension immediately. "We'll handle this together," she said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying intensity that reflected the seriousness of the situation. Samuel felt a mixture of gratitude and relief. For weeks he had been navigating life largely alone, and now he had someone at his side who was not only willing to help, but who also had the courage to face the challenge head-on. Together they went over their options, discussing the best way to respond to the neighbor's threats. She listened carefully, offering insights he hadn't considered, and her presence gave him a sense of confidence he hadn't realized he needed. The confrontation came the next afternoon. Samuel and the Apache girl rode together to meet the neighbor, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the boundary line. The man was waiting, his expression hard and unyielding. He demanded that Samuel give up a portion of the grazing land immediately. Samuel took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the tension in his body was evident. The Apache girl stepped forward, tall and unwavering, and spoke clearly and respectfully, explaining the legal ownership of the land and the history behind it. Her voice carried a mix of strength and diplomacy, and for a moment, Samuel felt a surge of pride. The situation quickly became heated. The neighbor raised his voice, threatening action and trying to intimidate them. Samuel could feel his frustration building, his hands clenching at his sides. But the Apache girl remained steady, guiding him through the confrontation with patience and strategy. She suggested compromises that protected their land while diffusing unnecessary anger, and she never wavered under pressure. Samuel began to see her not just as a companion or helper, but as someone he could trust completely. Her presence gave him courage, and together they managed to diffuse the tension without escalating the conflict. After the neighbor left, Samuel and the Apache girl rode back to the ranch in silence, both reflecting on what had just happened. The weight of the confrontation hung in the air, but so did a sense of relief and accomplishment. Samuel looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said quietly. She smiled, a mixture of pride and warmth in her expression. "We did it together," she replied. "You're not alone anymore." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Samuel found himself walking toward the Apache girl. They sat on the porch of the ranch house, the quiet hum of crickets filling the space around them. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to speak openly about his feelings. "I've spent so many years alone," he began, his voice soft. "I thought I could handle everything on my own. But these past weeks, having you here has changed everything. I don't want to be alone anymore." The Apache girl turned to him, her eyes reflecting both surprise and relief. "I've been feeling the same way," she admitted. "I've always been independent, but I've also been lonely. I wanted someone to understand me, someone I could trust. And now, I think I've found that with you." For a moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, the colors of the sky deepening into twilight. In that quiet moment, the bond between them felt complete, unspoken but undeniable. Days passed, and the emotional closeness between them grew even stronger. They continued to work side by side on the ranch, their movements synchronized almost naturally. She helped him mend fences, feed the animals, and manage the land, while he offered guidance and shared small moments of laughter. Their relationship was not built on grand gestures, but on shared effort, understanding, and trust. Each act of care, no matter how small, strengthened the connection between them. One night, a severe dust storm swept across the desert. The wind howled, whipping dust into every corner of the ranch. Samuel and the Apache girl worked tirelessly to secure the animals and protect the property. Mud and dust covered them, and the roar of the wind made conversation nearly impossible. At one point, a young calf became trapped in the fencing, struggling to free itself. Samuel rushed to help, but the fence began to give way under the storm's force. The Apache girl reached for the same section of fencing, their hands touching as they worked together. For a moment they both froze, realizing the intensity of the moment, not just the danger, but the shared experience, the trust and reliance they now had in each other. When the storm finally passed, they collapsed on the porch, exhausted but relieved. Samuel looked at her, noticing the mud streaks on her face, the determination in her eyes, and the quiet bravery that had carried them through the chaos. He realized in that moment how deeply he cared for her, not just for her strength, but for her heart, her spirit, and the way she had become a part of his life. The Apache girl looked back at him, her expression softening. "I've never felt this safe with anyone before," she said quietly. "With you, I feel home." That night, as they watched the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, both understood that something profound had shifted between them. The struggles they had faced together, the threats from neighbors, the storms, the challenges of running the ranch, had drawn them closer in ways neither could have predicted. They were no longer simply two people working together. They were partners, sharing life, trust, and the beginnings of love. The emotional peak of their journey was not marked by dramatic declarations or sudden events, but by the realization that they had found a bond that could endure hardship, laughter, and quiet moments alike. Samuel, who had once believed he could only be alone, discovered the strength to open his heart. The Apache girl, who had carried the weight of independence and loneliness, found someone who could understand and share her life. Together they had navigated challenges, faced fears, and discovered a warmth that neither had known before. By the end of this period, the ranch itself seemed to reflect their relationship. The fields, once just land to manage, now felt alive with possibility. The animals, the fences, and even the wind carried the echoes of shared effort and care. The quiet moments, watching sunsets, sharing meals, tending the land, became symbols of a deeper connection that would continue to grow. Both Samuel and the Apache girl realized that they had reached a turning point in their lives, one that promised not just survival, but companionship, understanding, and the potential for lasting happiness. Spring had arrived at the ranch, bringing with it the soft warmth of longer days and the fresh green of new growth. The desert, which had seemed harsh and unforgiving during the cold winter months, now glowed with color. Samuel looked out over the land and felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. The ranch had changed, not just in the way the fences were mended or the pastures tended, but in the quiet energy that filled it. The energy brought by the Apache girl, who had become more than just a helper. She had become a part of his life, a steady presence he relied on and cared for deeply. The Apache girl moved through the ranch with ease, her confidence and grace apparent in everything she did. She laughed more freely now, a sound that made Samuel smile even on the most difficult days. She had claimed her place on the ranch not as a guest or an outsider, but as someone who belonged. Samuel had watched her transform, not because he had changed her, but because the trust and warmth between them had allowed her to feel safe. She no longer carried the same weight of solitude she had when she first arrived, and in return, Samuel had begun to experience life in a way he hadn't in years. Their mornings were filled with shared work, checking on the cattle, repairing fences, and preparing feed. But it was the evenings that held the most meaning. They would sit together on the porch, sometimes talking about the day, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the desert. The wind through the mesquite trees, the distant cry of a hawk, and the occasional rustle of cattle created a rhythm that seemed to mirror their own connection. Each day the bond between them grew stronger, built not on grand gestures but on steady companionship, trust, and mutual respect. One afternoon, as they were repairing a gate near the edge of the property, Samuel paused to look at the Apache girl. She was focused on her task, her hands skillfully tying knots, but she glanced up at him and smiled. "You know," she said, "I never imagined I could feel this at home somewhere that isn't my own community. I didn't think I would ever find someone I could truly trust, someone who would understand me." Samuel felt a warmth spread through his chest. "And yet, here we are," he replied softly. It seems life has a way of surprising us. Their partnership extended beyond work. They faced small challenges together, like navigating the occasional dispute with neighbors or repairing damage after a summer storm. Each obstacle tested their trust and patience, but also strengthened their connection. They learned to rely on each other, to communicate without words, and to anticipate each other's needs. Samuel realized that having someone beside him didn't diminish his independence. It enhanced it. He could face difficulties with more confidence, and the Apache girl's presence made the hardships feel lighter. There were also moments of quiet reflection. One evening, after a long day of tending the animals, Samuel and the Apache girl walked to a small hill overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the landscape. Samuel thought about the years he had spent in solitude, the grief he had carried since losing his wife, and the fear he had felt about opening his heart again. Now, seeing the Apache girl beside him, he realized that life had given him a second chance, not just to live, but to connect, to care, and to be cared for in return. The Apache girl spoke first, her voice thoughtful. "I've learned something here," she said, "about trust, patience, and the value of companionship. I thought being strong meant being alone, but I see now that true strength includes letting someone in, sharing life, and accepting support." Samuel nodded, understanding completely. He had spent years equating strength with solitude, but she had taught him otherwise. Strength, he realized, could also mean vulnerability, honesty, and the courage to open one's heart after loss. Over time, they created routines that brought comfort and joy. They prepared meals together, shared stories of their past, and found pleasure in the simplest things: a sunrise over the desert, a calf that finally learned to stand steadily, or a quiet evening spent watching the stars. They learned to laugh together, to comfort each other, and to face the challenges of ranch life as a team. Each shared moment reinforced the bond between them, building a foundation of trust and respect that would endure far beyond the difficulties of the land. The animals themselves seemed to reflect the harmony that had developed. The cattle were calmer, the dogs more content, and even the smaller tasks on the ranch became smoother with two people working together. Samuel noticed how much lighter life felt when shared, how the weight of responsibility seemed easier when it was carried by someone who understood and cared. The Apache girl, too, found a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded her before. She had come to the ranch seeking warmth, but she found more than that. She found a home, a partnership, and a life in which her strengths were valued and her heart accepted. One morning, after a particularly peaceful night, Samuel and the Apache girl sat together by the water trough, watching the young calves play. Samuel felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Life hasn't been easy," he said, "but I feel like I'm finally living fully again. You've changed that for me." The Apache girl smiled, her eyes reflecting the rising sun. "And you've changed me too," she said softly. "I never knew I could feel this safe, this understood, this connected to someone. I've found something here that I thought I would never have." As the seasons changed, their lives became intertwined in ways that felt natural and right. The ranch no longer felt lonely, nor did it feel like just a place of work. It was alive with shared effort, laughter, and care. They had built a rhythm together, one that combined independence with partnership, strength with vulnerability. Each day was a small victory, each evening a reminder of what they had discovered: that life is better when shared, that companionship can heal wounds, and that trust can create warmth even in the harshest environments. By the end of the story, Samuel and the Apache girl had not only overcome loneliness and hardship, but had also discovered a life of meaning and connection. The desert, once a symbol of isolation, now represented resilience, growth, and beauty. They had faced storms, disputes, and fear, and had emerged stronger together. The warmth they found in each other was not fleeting or superficial. It was built on honesty, trust, and shared experience. Looking out over the ranch one evening, Samuel felt a profound sense of peace. The Apache girl stood beside him, her hand brushing against his as they watched the sun set. They had found in each other not just companionship, but understanding, support, and the beginnings of love. The challenges of life were still present, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Together they could face anything. Their story left a lesson that was simple yet powerful. Life is not just about surviving, but about connecting, trusting, and sharing. Strength is not measured by solitude alone. It is also measured by the courage to open one's heart, to let someone in, and to create warmth in a world that can be harsh and unforgiving. Samuel and the Apache girl had discovered that the greatest victories are often found not in conquering the land, but in finding companionship, trust, and understanding in another human being. And so, the ranch continued to thrive, not just because of the work done on the land, but because of the care, respect, and warmth shared between two people who had once been alone. Their lives, once defined by solitude and hardship, were now marked by connection and hope. Together they had learned that life's true value lies not in possessions or accomplishments alone, but in the relationships that sustain us, the bonds that heal us, and the love that makes us feel fully alive.